Welcome, everyone. My name is Olivia Allen, and it is a sincere pleasure to be with all of you today as a representative of Landmark Ventures, host of the Social Innovation Summit. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Social Innovation Summit, I am pleased to have the honor to perhaps be the first to introduce you. The Social Innovation Summit is an engaging platform designed to elevate groundbreaking ideas, map out new territories to embrace social change, and shine a light on innovative thought leaders who are shaping the world for better. Throughout the year, the Social Innovation Summit platform is honored to partner with the most forward-thinking organizations to amplify critical conversations and explore solutions to the biggest social issues of the day. Today is the third event of a four-part event series where we've teamed up with the incredible AARP. AARP is an organization dedicated to empowering humans everywhere to choose how they live as they age. Our collaborative year-long event series is focusing on how to elevate the national dialogue around issues that impact longer and healthier lives for all communities. To learn more about AARP's efforts on how we create a future that embraces equity and innovation across the lifespan, please visit aarp.org/build equity. Today is going to be incredible. We will be sharing a sequence of thoughtful, solutions-focused dialogues on strategies and actions that leaders across all sectors can take to address the longevity gap, such as creating pathways to wealth and rethinking community investment. Thank you so much for being here. I have a little bit of housekeeping. We've sent all attendees a digital brochure with speaker bios and the agenda for today. And we're taking questions from the audience that our panelists will answer toward the end of our discussion. So please submit your questions for our panelists in the Q&A function throughout the event. All right, get ready, everybody. This hour is going to be absolutely phenomenal. First, we are privileged to welcome Chike Agu for a keynote interview on his perspectives as Chief Innovation Officer for the United States Department of Labor. We'll then shift to our featured panel for the day, a dynamic discussion between Antonio Tijarino, President and CEO of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, Camille Bouvisset, Director of Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative at the Brookings Institute, and Shad Hamed, Chief Operating Officer of Opportunity at Work. Let's get started. I am so pleased to welcome our incredible host, the first moderator for today's event, Vice President of Global Thought Leadership at AARP, Ms. Stacey Alexander. Stacey, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia, for that wonderful introduction. We are so pleased that you all are here with us again today. Again, I'm Stacey Alexander, Vice President of AARP's Thought Leadership Team. And it's great to be back as part of our Build Equity series with the Social Innovation Summit. And really great to connect with Chike Agu, Chief Innovation Officer for the U.S. Department of Labor, and our three great panelists who will be talking with us to surface solutions to overcome the long-term economic trends underpinning the longevity gap. The past few decades have seen economic mobility decrease and inequality rise. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, accelerated these long-standing trends as the gap between the top and bottom widened while the middle hollowed out. This is not just a story of economics, but one of longevity. The type of job you work and the amount of wealth you amass have a distinct correlation to the number of years you will live. Over the past year, our Build Equity series has explored new ways to untangle and tackle the complex web of factors contributing to inequity with the ultimate goal of closing the longevity gap. Today's conversations features thought leaders with deep expertise in developing solutions and actions that companies and organizations can take to address the economic questions that bind us together. What do we need to consider to ensure that all people can afford to live longer? That's what we will explore today. And so I am now pleased to bring to the virtual stage Chike Agu, Chief Innovation Officer at the United States Department of Labor. His bio is in your digital brochure, so I will not be reading his very long and distinguished bio in detail. Instead, we'll jump right into questions. Welcome, Chike.
Stacey, thanks so much for having me, and to Landmark and and AARP and all the amazing partners. Thank you so much for having this conversation and for being such a wonderful host. I'm excited to be here.
Great, we're glad to have you. And you were appointed by President Biden and started in this position as the Chief Innovation Officer at the Department of Labor in January. So tell us about your priorities and the steps you're taking to move towards your goals at DOL.
So first, let me just also say, I know I speak for the Biden administration and for my secretary, Marty Walsh, for how important I think this conversation is. And as some folks ask me kind of, what is the Biden administration focused on? And in many ways, President Biden makes it pretty clear. If you look at most of the things that this administration is focused on, it's frankly a couple. First, obviously, it's beating this COVID pandemic once and for all. It's secondly, creating jobs, not just simply getting back to the economy we had before, but hopefully building back better. It's a phrase that's used a lot, but when we say it, we mean it. Thirdly, fighting climate change, which we know is a generational challenge and crisis. And then lastly, equity. How do we make sure that every community, every American, every person who is here in this country has the same benefit of America? I think, Stacey, you talked about in your opening remarks that frankly, the type of life you have, the type of wealth you amass is very much linked to how long you live. And in many ways, if you look at a lot of the work the Biden administration is focused on, is one, how do we make sure that more people can earn more wealth and have a better economic standard of life to affect that? And also, frankly, how do we break that link? How do we make sure that, frankly, just because someone's not wealthy doesn't mean they don't get to live as long? Don't mean that they don't get to pursue lives of equal meaning, of equal value. And so in many ways, a lot of it is a focus on, in some ways, a key question that I think that you bring here. When I think about us at the Department of Labor, and I always start with a quick labor 101, the Department of Labor is over 100 years old. And if you think about the three big buckets of work the Department of Labor does, one, we provide really clear labor market information by my colleagues at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who are some of the best in the world in terms of economists and statisticians. Secondly, we invest in the American workforce through training and benefits like unemployment insurance, as well as foreign labor. And then lastly, we are engaged in worker protection, making sure that when people are on the job, they are protected, they are respected, and they are dignified. And these are my colleagues at places like OSHA. These are places like the Employee Benefit Security Administration. So that's just a quick orientation of what labor does. And so when I think about my job, I report to the Deputy Secretary. And we actually, Julie Sue was just confirmed yesterday to be our Deputy Secretary, and we are very excited about her from the great state of California. I think about how do we use the most innovative technologies, practices, and partnerships to accelerate the missions that you just heard me mention. One of the key things I think about with the population that AARP serves that frankly will benefit that population as well as the country is when I think about the population that the AARP serves, this is a population with a wealth of experience and skills that they've developed over a lifetime in the American workforce. And the question is, how do we get the continual benefit of those skills over time? One, for themselves, but two, for the rest of the country. And what we've seen over the last, frankly, year, 16 months is that many people have been displaced from the work that they were doing and trying to figure out where they can get back in to fit in. And the question is, how can the Department of Labor make that easier? And so that's through investing in workforce. President Biden has talked about whether it be from infrastructure or anything else, we must invest in those human beings as well who are going to be part of that. That's also investing in benefits like unemployment insurance. That's also about investing in, which is the thing that's not as talked about as much. How do we help people go from one spot in the economy to another? And so one example that I always use here is if you look at two very different jobs, they have very similar skills. One job, think of you're in a restaurant and think about the person in the back kitchen who directs what cook cooks what order and what waiter takes out what order. And then so that's one job, the person managing a kitchen. Think about another job, which is a factory line manager, someone who basically sits on the line at a plant and basically directs where goods go. They're very actually similar skills. They're basically logistics and supply management. But how do we help people who are in that first job know that they have skills to be in this other job that might be growing? That's a thing that we at the Department of Labor think about in terms of how do we make that easier in terms of people knowing, one, how their skills match up to things that are available, and then how do we make sure that, particularly for older Americans, that they can be connected quickly to that next job and continue their career if they so choose. And so that's the thing that we at the Department of Labor think about a good amount. And it's one thing that we know will help, number one, the folks AARP serves make the most of their lives. And more importantly, or as important, how it allows America to get the most of, frankly, all their experience, all their skills, and all that they've brought to the table over their lives here in this country. So let me stop there because I could go on for for a while, but hopefully that's a good place to start.
No, that's a great place to start. And I'm going to back up a little bit because you talked a little bit about, DOL's mission kind of being also helping the dignity and value of workers and folks in their labor. And I want to learn a little bit more about what motivated you to do this work. I see a quote that you wrote that says, "We are prisoners of biography, and I have no desire or ability to escape mine." So can you give us, our audience some background on your life experience and how it fits into your current role leading innovation at DOL?
No, thank you for the question. And so, that's a quote I stole from Bill Clinton.
I'll be stealing it from you. So
no, and it's feel free. It's best practice. It's not stealing. But for me, my family is a very classic immigrant story to this country. My family is from a small village in eastern Nigeria that most Nigerians themselves will never go to and never visit. None of my grandparents went past middle school, and my parents who grew up there, they literally had Peace Corps volunteers in their classrooms. And when they were, frankly, teenagers, they got a chance to come to the United States and study. My dad went to UT, my mom went to Rutgers University, public universities, and got to have me and my siblings and give us the life that we have today. And so in a generation, you have my grandparents who didn't go past middle school, to me, being appointed by President Biden and being able to talk to all of you. That's something that we should celebrate, but it's also, for me, something I take as a challenge, which is we know that the journey that I just talked about is unlikely, particularly for, frankly, people of color, immigrants, women here in this country. And so the question for me has always been, how do I replicate for others that which has been done for me? And when I think about that, there's no way to escape how do we empower the American worker? Because when I look at when we've been able to do that consistently in history, it's when we've empowered the American worker through the increase in their skills, through the increasing the dignity of their labor, and also bringing innovative practice to bear to modernize the entire workforce and economy around them. So that's what kind of brings me here. And in many ways, it's how do more people get what I got, which I didn't deserve. I didn't get it because I was I was in the right place at the right time. And what you talked about, again, that people's dignity and length of their lives should not be tied to their wealth. I think that's the question I've always been trying to answer. And until I heard those words, I didn't quite have the precise articulation. But that's what I've been trying to do. And I know, being in this administration, being with Secretary Walsh, I couldn't imagine a better place to be doing it.
And hearing your story and the opportunity that your parents received and then that you ultimately received is a great example of what can change in a generation if there's the opportunity and the will to do so. And so that's what inspires the conversation that we're having today with leaders like you, all the great ideas that we hear that we can put into practice. So the question for you is, how can we create approaches to increasing equity across the lifespan when it comes to wealth and work? And who should we engage in those conversations and those efforts?
So let me start with the second question first. The answer is we need to engage everyone. You'll hear President Biden talk a lot, particularly around COVID, about what he calls a whole of government approach. And I would always take that a step further, which is we need a whole of society approach. If government could solve this all by itself, it would have been fixed already. If the private sector could fix this by itself, it would have been fixed already, or the nonprofit space. We all need to be working together in concert, and there's no one who doesn't have a stake or a responsibility in this. I would add as a caveat there, when we say everyone, we need to actually also include the people that we're trying to help. In my case, it's the American worker. And one of my good friends, a guy named Wes Moore, who you just stepped down from running the Robin Hood Foundation, he talks about the people who are affected need to not only have a voice, but a vote in the process and a vote in the things that we say we are trying to do for them. As someone who came from the private sector, you would never design a product without talking to the customer. I will say at times, those of us who are trying to do good, we don't always do that for the folks that we're trying to help, and we have to do that here. So that's the question of the who. Now, what is the what? And so when I think about this at the Department of Labor, I think about kind of 5 big questions, and I'll run through them really, really quickly. The first is, how do we identify the work of the future? How do we identify where jobs are going to be growing so that we know, again, what we're preparing people for? And I think that is particularly true for older Americans. Secondly, how do we make sure that we're giving people the skills to do those jobs and to do that work? And that's not just the technical skills, but the 21st century, what some people call soft skills that we know are really critical around leadership, communication, things like that. And increasingly, digital skills. these technological skills are now part of almost every job that's out there in the market, particularly ones that are paying the best wages and have benefits. Third question, which is one that's not talked about enough, is how do we make sure the worker and the work can find each other? How do we make sure that, I think about my home of Prince George's County, we have the largest casino on the Eastern Seaboard from MGM in my county. And we also have people who need work. And there are jobs at that casino that someone could work at, but do they always know, but do they always know of each other? And so how do we make sure just that examples like that don't exist? Lastly, how do we make sure that our benefit systems, frankly, are responsive and actually serve not simply as a safety net, but a trampoline to lift people back into the market when they fall out? And the last piece, when someone is in the job, how do we make sure they're respected, protected, dignified? And I'll add one more, which is advancing. How do we make sure that someone who starts out, in the equivalent of the mailroom can one day actually end up being the CEO of the company? And we know from an equity perspective, how do we have data across those entire 5 questions that we understand how we're performing, not just in aggregate, but in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of disability status? And so that's what we think about here. We have to think about, in some ways, you don't eat the elephant whole, but you have to eat it in really clear and strategic bites. And you have to know what's happening the whole way. And particularly, how do we make sure that another element of equity, age and longevity, is also part of that? Because again, when I think about the countries that we compete against, a lot of them are bigger than we are in terms of population. And one thing that I know President Biden has said, and something I heard President Obama say previously, is that we don't have an American to waste. And so the only way that we're going to be able to make the most of every American is to work across that entire span and be dogged and rigorous across the way. I
love that, dogged and rigorous. And that truly is what it requires. I'm going to ask you this question because our time is getting away. That countdown clock is a little bit cruel. As we continue to build our inclusive workforce of the future, what do you consider to be some promising or potentially game-changing innovations that we should be paying attention to and considering? And that's for the public or the private sector.
Sure. And I think, honestly, all of them are going to require all sectors.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of things. One, I'm really excited about looking at skill adjacencies. And when I say skill adjacencies, and this is a place where my colleague Shad from Upcoming Work will talk about the STARS movement. You have millions of workers in this country who have the skills to earn more than they do right now, but they don't, because they can't quite find that place in the market. So how do we find people with skills who can transfer those skills to higher paying occupations and frankly make more for themselves and their families? And there are lots of low tech and high tech ways to facilitate that. So that's number one. I think number two, in terms of skill acquisitions, there are lots of promising emerging technologies that I think that we can use to help make it easier for people to gain skills. One space I'll look at, just name, is XR, virtual reality. You have many new types of experiments at places like, frankly, the University of Maryland, who are using XR to upskill returning citizens behind the walls. You have companies like Tailspin who are using XR to train people to be claims adjusters in a purely contactless and remote way for the insurance industry. Last piece is the data piece. We have to keep ourselves accountable and know how we're doing. It can't just be done on gut. And I'm particularly excited and rigorous and committed to how do we get more of this data about how we're performing in our workforce system, cut along the lines of race, gender, class, age, disability status, because that's going to tell us not just how we're doing in aggregate, but how are we doing and where can we focus and where can we do better. And we know, frankly, but I think all of us in our guts know anecdotally where we need to do better and with whom we need to do better. But we've got to have the data so that we are rigorous. And frankly, we cannot have debates about feelings, but debates about facts.
Thank you so much, Chike, for this conversation. And we look at this as just the beginning of a conversation as we engage with you in your innovation work. But again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to AARP, to Landmark, and to all the amazing speakers who will be here today.
Great, thank you. I'm now pleased to bring to the stage my colleague, Melissa Grober-Morrow, who is Director of Financial Resilience for AARP, who will introduce our panelists and go on with the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Stacy said, I'm Melissa Grober-Morrow, Director of Financial Resilience on the Thought Leadership team at AARP, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's discussion with Shad Ahmed, Chief Operating Officer at Opportunity at Work, Camille Rashad, Senior Fellow in Economic Studies, Governance Studies and the Metropolitan Policy Program, and Director of the Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative at Brookings Institution, and Antonio T. Girino, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. And again, you can find each of their distinguished bios in the event brochure. We will have time for audience questions, so please submit questions for the panelists throughout the session by using the Zoom Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to make sure that we're all on the camera. Okay, great. The title of today's conversation points to the correlation between longevity and wealth. How have you seen this play out in your own work? And what steps can we take in terms of collaborating across sectors to develop solutions that address the inequities seemingly baked into the system? Would anyone like to jump in and start us off?
Well, I will, because somebody has to start, and actually this is a conversation that I think is really interesting, very energizing, and certainly a great lead up with Chike's interview with Stacy. So what I would say in general is that, obviously we're all living longer, we're working longer, and so our opportunities to build wealth are theoretically longer, right? The number of years that we're in the workforce is actually longer. But all of that really depends on a couple of things that I know we're going to get into today. Just at a really high level, it really depends obviously on having sufficient income to put away for when you're no longer working and you're then, actually living on that accumulated savings. The second thing is you do have to have benefits that allow you to put away funds, so retirement benefits, et cetera. And you also want to be able to enjoy the time that you're no longer working, meaning your health has to be really good. Otherwise, you're going to spend a good portion of those savings on healthcare issues. So those things seem pretty basic, but since we mostly have a private sector audience here, and we are talking a lot about the divide between people who have consistently and systematically been locked out of income generation benefits that are afforded as part of a job, and who for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with systemic discrimination, do not enjoy excellent health. Then it's less of an obvious conversation about how we move populations and people who do not enjoy, constant, secure income, savings, or other kinds of benefits, and don't enjoy good health. So what are our responsibilities? And so there, I think the private sector has a role to play. And I would say there, the first thing is we should try to increase the number of jobs that we are offering people that actually pay benefits. And that actually have benefits that both health and retirement, et cetera. And that should be really, sort of the starting point. The second thing is we know that there's discrimination in the workplace. So there have to be a number of steps that are taken by private sector employers to really make sure they're reaching into the corners of the economy where perhaps people aren't aware that they exist. And you really have to make an extra effort. Everybody knows that. Everybody who researches these groups knows that. And then the final thing is we as a country really have to make an incredibly sustained effort to continue to reach into communities that historically have not had good health care for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with discrimination. And we really have to make the investment there to make sure that these folks can enjoy, a post-work life.
Thank you. Yeah, Shad, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and just to build on what Camille was saying, I think for us at Opportunity at Work, when we think about longevity, we think about a worker's ability to take their lifelong learning and translate that into earning over time and wealth accumulation, which does then help with all the other sets of benefits that are required to live a thriving life. Our own research has shown we're focused on workers without a 4-year degree, whom we call stars, those who are skilled through alternative routes. And of the 70 million plus stars in America, we found that 30 million have skills for jobs that could pay 70% more on average. And so it just shows our labor market is broken. It's fundamentally not seeing the signals and understanding what a worker can bring to the table that then could convert into a much more enriching life for that worker. As Chike mentioned, there's a lot of work being done, not just at Opportunity Work, but many places, including Brookings and other places on skills adjacencies and how we can understand those signals better to ensure that learning is translated across. From a sector perspective, it really does take all sectors. We're very much focused on the demand side of the equation, this issue of access. When we think about historically excluded groups, majority of which are stars, whether they're Black workers or Hispanic workers, we have to think differently about those sources of talent, especially on the private sector or the employer side of the equation. That includes the public sector, who's a major employer as well. And start there, because the private sector and the public sector have to be seeking out those signals of real skills and move to more skills-based talent management practices. At the same time, the nonprofit and public sector also have a role to play in the education sector on helping to support that continuous skill building, ensuring that workers are able to talk about and explain their skills and demonstrate those skills in a way that makes sense for many of these 21st century jobs. So there's lots of experiments underway across the country in lots of places, but we have to be clear that the market is broken today. And so we have to work through the incentive structures and the way these markets work, or we can reskill all we want till we're blue in the face. But if we don't have, we don't change the access side of the equation with good jobs, with great benefits, we're not going to make a dent into turning those skills into that learning into earning.
I want to squeeze something in because everything my fellow panelists said are right on target, but I just want to make it unique in terms of the focus on youth. I think 64 million 64 million people are in multi-generational families. And I think that it's important to also, in the Latino community and other communities, that's even more prevalent. And a lot of the responsibility falls on youth to be able to have some of those trainings as well. That'll then lift the entire family, as Shad and Camille were saying. So I think it's important for us, for instance, that through our Code as Second Language program, that we're teaching 100,000 kids how to code, to hopefully create an opportunity, greater opportunities in the workforce to be able to support elders that are living within the family. I think what's one of the things that's interesting is English learners have gravitated towards our coding programs because all of our research has shown, including parents and grandparents, that, well, look, I'm in my late 50s. I have a 10-year-old daughter. We would learn coding at the exact same level. You don't have to have a different curriculum for both of us to learn. We can learn at the same time. And we're seeing more and more parents and grandparents showing up to our coding programs to learn with their kids. One of the things that we found through our surveys was that they said, the English learners said it was easier to learn how to code than to learn English. And again, it's being able to create those additional opportunities, as Chike said, for future jobs. And if you think about those opportunities for someone that is working from home, especially if they're parents and grandparents, those are opportunities that America is looking for right now to fill. I mean, there's a million jobs that are going to be unfilled that are in the tech sector. And I think it's a real chance for us to try to fill those gaps. And the last thing I want to say is it's inherent in a lot of people in our families, which I think Shad was saying as well. What are those skills that you inherently have, that you bring, especially as immigrants, that you bring to this country? And I remember walking down the street with my uncle, and there would be a broken toaster that somebody threw out, and he would pick up the toaster, and next thing you know, we're using that toaster. That is problem solving. That's ingenuity. Those are the same skills that you would need in things like coding and all these other programs. And lastly, just really appreciate that you had Chike on here, because he also represents the great promise of our immigrant communities and what we bring to this great country, and as well as being able to provide those opportunities for America to benefit from our immigrant communities.
Thank you. Really great responses, and we'll dig in more. But I want to ask another question, which is one of the key themes from your collective work that we've touched upon throughout our Build Equity series is how to represent the people who aren't in the room when you connect with top executives and influencers. How do you make sure that the perspective of underserved communities is part of the dialogue? And Antonio, I know you and I spoke about this previously, so I'm wondering if we could start with you to share your perspective with the audience today.
I think we all have a responsibility to represent who isn't in that room, Melissa, and thank you. I remember a spirited conversation we had that we were on the same page, but I think there's an additional level of pressure if you're a woman, or if you're Black, or if you're an immigrant, or if you're LGBTQ plus or an other disabled community. You now represent everyone that they're going to meet at that moment, everyone that they've seen on TV, everyone that they've read about in the news. So that's an additional level of pressure and responsibility for a lot of us that represent underrepresented communities in some of these rooms. And we have to always understand that our responsibility is also to make sure that we're also bringing others in to bring that perspective. I can give you the perspective of the Latino community to some extent, but I don't know what it's like to be a trans person who's Black Latinx. I don't even know what it's like to be another middle-aged Latino man that came from Nicaragua. We all have different experiences. So the best that we can do is to create an opportunity for them to understand our communities better. And a lot of that comes from listening to our communities. And again, I really appreciate what Chike said, that you wouldn't do a focus group. You have to do a focus group when you're creating a product. It should be the same thing when you're dealing with people. I have to say too, that in these times, I've been in a lot of rooms where we have to call out comments that we weren't comfortable with, and let people know that we're not comfortable in those rooms. I've heard a lot of homophobic, sexist, racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, even making fun of the disabled in a lot of meetings that I've had that are very high level meetings that we're privileged to be in that room. Part of that privilege is to make sure that you call people out and you represent. I don't have to be a woman to call out sexism or to let them know that I'm not comfortable with it. You have to do it in a way that hopefully we're enlightening people and educating them, but at the same time, it has to be clear that we're not comfortable. And I actually had someone say, this is supposed to be a safe space for any conversation. Well, not those conversations. And don't invite me if you don't want to hear my point of view. And then the last thing I'll say about being in those privileged rooms is that you're there for a reason. I remember being on the national PTA board. I was the only Latino at that time serving because the first African-American male in their 117-year history appointed me. He was a very good friend of mine, Oath Thornton. There was a reason to make sure that two replaced us as we left those boards. So it's not as simple as just being in there and representing. It's also an onus on us to make sure that that two will take our place, or three or four. It's not good enough to just have one person in the room and check that box. So and be heard. We have a voice to be in there. You can't just quietly be in there and sit in a corner and feel lucky to be in there. If you're in that room, you're not lucky to be there. You're being asked for your opinion. And if they're not asking, it's your job to deliver a message anyway.
Thank you so much. I thank you for the voice that you bring to the conversation and for speaking out on behalf of others. Is there anything that Camille or Rashad you want to add to that response?
I just think, sorry, Rashad, go ahead.
Go for it, Camille.
No, I was just going to say really quickly, I loved all of your comments, Antonio, but I would also just add that you can ask people, you can go directly. You don't need to have multiple layers of separation. If you want to find out how people in the community feel about that, just go and ask them.
Yeah. And I think for us, it's just such an important part of what we're trying to do as we are trying to spearhead a movement around access for those without degrees. We're always trying different ways to bring the voice of stars in every discussion. We have fortunate to have a lot of access with the C-suite with many companies, and so we'll do. There's a few ways how that shows up. One is our own org. We're at 25% of our organization are stars themselves, including our head of people, our head of customer success. We want to walk our walk and show that we're about those without degrees, and we know they have skills, and we have more work to do there ourselves. And so who's showing up at the table, our stars themselves. Secondly, we're launching an advisory council of stars led by Lashana Lewis, who's been an important partner of ours. She's just an incredible star herself, who's really helped to evangelize the movement, and having her voice in a lot of discussions in this council that's across section of all the many groups that stars are about. And we talk about intersectionality, as Antonio was talking about. It's so critical, and bringing them into those discussions with employers. And lastly, we are encouraging employers to bring their own stars and recognize them in their companies. In light of the last year with the reckoning around race, we are having lots of very candid discussions, more so than any time in my career, where 60% of the front line of a given company are coming from historically excluded groups, and 10% of the directors who lead those groups are represented or come from those groups themselves, and they know there's something amiss here. And so when they all these executives reflect on, they've worked with stars in the past, they know that the skills they bring to the table, and how do you make that personal? So the mind, the heart part of this equation, and as Lashana says, how do you get more and more leaders on the private sector to understand stars are not one in a million, they're one of millions. And so it's not about the exception, it's actually, there's millions more out there that why don't we have stars recruiting like we have campus recruiting? We don't have that today in most companies in America. That's 2/3 of the workforce you're not even thinking about. So how do we get those shifts to happen, both with data and both with real personal stories?
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before we turn to questions from the audience. So the COVID-19 pandemic put a spotlight on a number of issues and challenges that existed long before the spring of 2020. And we know from previous experience that communities of color typically fare worse in terms of how quickly they recover. What have we learned from the Great Recession and other previous crises that can help us recover equitably from COVID-19? And I'm wondering here if we could actually start with Shad, given what you saw happening, what companies' responses were after the Great Recession.
Yeah, so the thing that we noticed after the Great Recession is with what happened, a more slack labor market, is you started to see many more requirements put on jobs, and with the corresponding rise of technology in recruiting, for example, right? So you post a job, you can get hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants around the country for a given job. So why can't I go for the best? And if you're in the current mindset that having a degree, and a degree even from a certain school or a certain type of program, I can have my pick. And so you saw a lot of degree requirements on the upswing, and the important work by Harvard Business School and Accenture and Grads of Life with Dismissed by Degrees really pointed a light on that trend of degree inflation. What we're actually seeing now is actually a very interesting twist with much more awareness around race equity, a much more multi-sector dialogue around the 2/3 of the workforce who don't have a degree. We're hopeful in that we're seeing that the degree requirements are starting to drop on new postings. And so there's some new data coming in from LinkedIn and Burning Glass and a few others that job postings are starting to pull away those degree requirements. Now, is that turning into actual hiring of stars? Remains to be seen, but that is a promising trend. I think the other piece of it is, a lot has been made about in this market condition, how do you give workers more voice and power in the discussion and in selecting those pathways and having those opportunities? And so we're hopeful that we're seeing more of that, but we have to be deliberate. For example, when we think about Black communities in America, companies should be sourcing actively from great community organizations working with workers in those communities. As some of the work that Camille's done on social networks, those are so vital, and cutting through some of that and being very deliberate on if you grow up in a certain neighborhood, you don't know about the information isn't there, and that's inexcusable in the information age. That information is there, it's just not being compiled and placed in the right places for much of America to access. And so how do we be deliberate, in this moment, so we really are building back in a way that we're not just repeating the mistakes of the last recession?
Great. I'm going to go ahead and move us along to take questions from the audience because they're starting to come in.
Melissa, do you mind if I just ask? I just want to respond to that very quickly. Sure. There's something that's been inherently different about the latest crisis that we just faced, and that is the digital divide. And I think that it's important for us to address that in a unique way, especially with our 50 plus populations as well as youth. This has been a source when we're dealing with mental health issues, historic mental health issues that affect everything, family dynamics, societal dynamics, just whatever job you might have, it's going to affect even wanting to go out and get a job. We're also dealing with that isolation, helplessness, and that divide has gotten bigger and bigger as we become more and more dependent on access to technology. And during COVID too, I think it's important to mention, like 5 out of 6 Latinos couldn't work from home. So they were in harm's way in order for all of us to be able to work comfortably from home, in terms of what that production line looks like to deliver us our goods or whatever we needed, starting with farm workers, for instance, that were in the fields and not looked at as essential workers, when who's more essential than those at the start of that line. So when we're talking about also with those, as I mentioned earlier, the multi-generational families, how is it that you're connecting those families to each other? And I wrote in an article that that there's no vaccination for the digital divide or the educational crisis of 2020. And that goes all the way up the line, as well as workforce challenges. So I just wanted to mention that should be a priority for us as we're coming out of this in order to bounce back, is closing that gap in order to be able to have a chance to advance or take advantage of all the great programs that Shad is doing and what Camille's research is showing. It all starts with being connected.
Yeah, I mean, Antonio, I just want to bring up a really important point. During the pandemic, there was a lot of appreciation for essential workers, and even there was talk of like a GI Bill for essential workers and those types of things. It's fading away quickly, right? And so I think there is, like, again, essential workers have shown they have real skills, foundational skills. Otherwise, that if we don't value, we're back to square one again. And so that is something we should all be mindful of as we move forward.
And a lot of them fall within your stars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I do want to make sure we get to some of the audience questions because we've got several already in our Q&A, but these have been all really great points. And I wish we had more time to talk. So one question from the audience is, how can the private sector contribute to closing the wealth gap? Are there any examples of best practices you are seeing by private sector actors that can or should be replicated?
I can take that one. When we talk to companies, there's 3 main ways companies can play a role in this. And in light of the past year with the pandemic, and thinking differently about race equity, we're seeing a lot of movement with important initiatives like 110, which is focused on Black stars. The Business Roundtable is really thinking seriously across 80 plus companies around what they could do differently on skills-based talent practices. One is just looking at the stars and those workers in your own midst. 30 million stars are over the age of 50. 10 million are Black workers. Like, how do you understand those stars that are sitting in all parts of your organization, thinking about internal mobility deliberately around that? There's a lot of work being done, but a lot to be figured out on that. Second is your sources of recruiting. How do you think about sources of recruiting from these populations in a very different way? It starts with community colleges, it starts with nonprofit providers, but the roles, these good middle wage jobs that have benefits, that have those things, those should be opened up to stars themselves. And even those you're outsourcing and working with contractors for, how do you put pressure on your third-party vendors to bring stars into those roles? Because a lot of entry-level tech-enabled roles we're talking about sit there. And thirdly is, how do you think very differently on supporting the ongoing skill development of your workers, even if they leave? So if you have if you're in the retail sector, part of your value proposition, it's a tight labor market, to retain workers is having great educational benefits and support so that they can move to the next job. That encourages retention, that encourages attracting good talent. And so there's examples across these. For example, IBM has done just that. They've built a direct recruiting mechanism focused on those without degrees. Walmart is taking this really seriously around how do you offer educational benefits for employees to help them move to the next role, but even beyond the walls of Walmart, Amazon, and several others are starting to think differently on it. Early, lots more to learn, but there's some promising nuggets.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I'd love to hear Antonio's perspective on that.
Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of work to do. Look, one of the areas that I would love to see, and we've been pushing for it, is that investment in creating a boot camp in the tech side, for instance, that is run by a company. If they really want to invest, instead of going for the model that's been happening over the last 10 years, which isn't working very well, it's invest in a free boot camp instead of one that costs $15,000 to $20,000 and somebody has to leave their job for 3 months in order to get a job that starts at $75,000 to $100,000 at the other end of it. You know, have some sort of an assessment, work with organizations like ours and Shad's and others, and we'll find you the talent if you're offering it for free. It's going to cost you less than you going to a headhunter that's going to identify the talent for you. If you invest and set up a system where they have to work for you for 2 years, and there's a pathway within the company just in the tech sector. I'll just stay in that space. I do think that there's a way of creating your own ecosystems as companies that you actually can provide them with very specific training to what you need. We were going to work with a company called Infosys on doing something like this because they had some pretty interesting models in India, and we are going to apply it to the African American and Latino communities here in the United States. But you have to be able to invest in something that'll get you the results that you're looking for, and kind of take it within your own hands. And look, you have engineers and others that have to, a lot of places have to volunteer a percentage of their time in volunteer efforts. So why not make it something that's going to benefit the company and be along their area of expertise? I think that's critical.
I'll just add, I know you want to move on, so this is going to be super quick, but I just want to add to these both of these excellent contributions and say that it's really it's not enough to have just a DEI effort. We have a DEI office, we have a VP of DEI. That is just not enough. I think as both of my colleagues have mentioned here, you have to have a very intentional, focused strategy that really is about moving people in. So getting, kind of a recruitment mechanism that gets you the kinds of people that we're talking about, getting them in, supporting them, training them, making sure they are up for promotions when that's needed, continuing to support them all the way through. And so it's a very concerted effort it's much larger than just setting up a DEI office and looking at statistics and saying, okay, well, if a Latina comes into the pipeline, let's just make sure we interview her. I mean, it's just much more thoroughgoing, and it has to be a long-term strategy.
Thank you.
And a short-term strategy.
Both.
So I just want to follow up. Camille makes a very good point. First of all, we need more impatience in dealing with these issues. Those long-term strategies are great, but they can't be in lieu of a short-term strategy. So one is that we need more impatience. The other thing is there are companies out there that are incredibly innovative in terms of developing products. If it's truly a priority to diversify your workforce, use the same approach to developing a diversity strategy, as Camille was saying, as you do to developing the remarkable products that you're selling. And I promise you, they'll figure this out. The problem is that you have to actually have it be a priority where you're investing, and you're investing not just money-wise, but you're also investing the best minds to come up with those strategies internally and externally. And I do think that there's good intentions from companies. I just think that they're trying to take the path of least resistance. And there's a lot of resistance in the way, and those need to be broken down.
Well, we clearly need to bring this group together again because this conversation could go on much longer. But I want to end by asking each of you for one event, data point, or trend that gives you hope about the future, whether it be the fall of 2021 or next year. Anyone can start.
I'll just start really quickly. When I think about longevity, one of the things I think about beyond income and some of the topics we talked about today, training, et cetera. I also think about the importance of the built environment and how that shapes, how we think about the world, sort of our repertoire of options in terms of exercise and community and, all sorts of things. And one of I think the interesting trends that I've seen in some places is an emphasis on an equitable built environment, and how that's starting to be built into a lot of urban planning. I would not say it's an overwhelming trend, but it is a trend. And I think that gives me a lot of hope.
Great one. Shad?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we're involved in an initiative with some of our partners in Skill Up and Jobs for the Future and Workday in the Bay Area, which is the heart of tech companies and San Francisco from an economic mobility. The Bay Area is a challenging place for stars, and I'm heartened by the response from the private sector. So much of what we do is demand led, and we need the companies to show up with those good middle wage jobs tagged for stars, saying they're looking for stars. And we've just started a few months ago, but there's a lot more energy and focus in the core business, not just, to Camille's point, the CSR side or the DEI champions, but about how to think differently. Take entry-level sales roles. Like 80% of those jobs have a degree requirement. A generation ago, you didn't need a degree to get into sales. Sales has been a very important pathway for the middle class of America, and those have been stars have been systematically shut out. And there's real discussions about how do we pull back on the degree requirements, but also source differently. And so if even places like the Bay Area, which is as elitist as it can get on these things, can move, I'm hopeful, other places. And there's many other pockets in Detroit and Houston and lots of places there where these discussions are happening with the right actors in the room with real intent. So very hopeful. I think we have a window and we got to be aggressive and not be incremental. And so how do we do that with all of the powers of our organizations across sectors? Because we have to be intentional.
Hey, Melissa, I'm really optimistic about coming out of 2020 for reasons that I think are broadly as human beings, as companies, as organizations, across all areas. I think we've become more adaptable and we become more agile in problem solving and malleable in addressing the issues that we need to address. I think we're much more creative than we were in 2019 because of the crisis. And so I actually believe that despite the destruction and the disruption and the tragedies that we faced in 2020, I do believe as communities and as companies and in that interaction together, that we are going to be a lot more creative and focused on problem solving and adaptable as we go forward. So I'm very optimistic about where we go from here.
I'm glad to hear it. And with that, I want to thank you so much to all of you for speaking with us about such an important topic. And I am going to turn it over to Stacey Alexander to close us out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all of our speakers for a wonderful conversation, both solutions-oriented and inspiring. And I really appreciate that you had all these great ideas but you also had the sense of urgency and optimism that has fueled our whole Build Equity series. We've spent the past year, asking very important, compelling questions and really trying to take advantage of the moments that we find ourselves in, particularly since the pandemic, to really propel the issue forward of, how we can build equity and longevity. And so we are so pleased that all these great speakers that have been a part of this journey. We invite you to check out aarp.org/build equity, where you can see the videos of all of our past Build Equity events, and also a collection of thought pieces and provocations from leaders from around different sectors and areas of expertise around this key question of building equity and longevity. So again, we will stay in touch. We will reach out to you on additional initiatives that we will be having. But again, thank you. And to quote Antonio Tiarino about this impatience, we need more impatience. So we encourage you to work with us as we continue to be impatient and build for solutions to build equity and longevity, and wealth and work are key components of that. So again, thank you for being with us today.